So I want to introduce you to someone from right here at Decatur City who actually has a lot of experience and insight when it comes to what we've been talking about. Wendi Nunnery is a local author living in Oakhurst. She and her husband Pierce have been involved at Decatur City for several years now, along with their 2 kids. Wendi has a new book coming out in October that really hits home with this topic. So we thought it would be a fun idea to spend a little time talking with her today. Her new book is called Good Enough: Learning to Let Go of Perfect for the Sake of Holy. So Wendi, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I've really been looking forward to this conversation.
Oh, me too. I've been looking forward to getting the opportunity to sit down with you and talk about this. So I kind of want to jump in. This book, Good Enough, it represents really a whole journey for you. It feels honestly like your life story in some ways. So could you take us back to the beginning of the journey and how that started and what faith looked like for you?
Sure. Well, I grew up in a small southern town. And like a lot of people who grow up in that environment, the concept of God and Jesus and faith were really familiar to me from a very young age. Both my parents were believers, but my dad especially was very devout, and he made it a high priority to share his faith with us. And alongside that, though, I was growing up in this culture in the 90s that was very performative. What would Jesus do? Purity culture. And that informed the way that I saw myself and the way that I saw God. I viewed goodness as something that I had to earn, and not just for myself, but in some ways, even though this wasn't explicitly stated, there was this idea in my mind that I was also somewhat responsible for policing the behavior of people around me, because there was so much fixation on right thinking, right theology, right behavior. And though I loved God very deeply, I thought that my goodness was something separate from him that I had to do on my own, because in my mind, he was a loving parent like my parents were, but he was waiting on me to mess up. And it wasn't until I got into my 20s and I started dealing with having intrusive thoughts and struggling with my mental health, but not knowing at the time that that was undiagnosed obsessive compulsive disorder, that I had to really rethink what I had believed about God and myself up to that point, because so much of it was right and wrong, black and white. There wasn't a lot of room for doubt or uncertainty. And the thing about having obsessive compulsive disorder is that in order to live it and be healthy, you have to get really uncomfortable with doubt and uncertainty. And so that really upended a lot of the things that I had believed about God up until that point.
Sure. Those thoughts can be so damaging to our faith, and we're gonna dive into that a little bit more in a minute. But one of the things I love about your story is that even though it's unique to you, I think there's so many threads that all of us can connect with and can relate to. And I think especially for those of us who consider ourselves Christ followers, it can be especially hard to kind of raise our hand and admit that things are hard and we're not doing very good. So how did you finally come to that place where you could admit, hey, things aren't going that great?
It was tough, because I think that when I first started having those intrusive thoughts and realizing that something was going on, I thought that it was me who had just suddenly gone from good to bad. Because when you grow up with this mindset, when your faith tradition tells you that if you do this, then God will do this, when things go wrong, it's hard not to automatically assume that that's the result of your own sin and not just your own humanity. And being a human and living in a world that's broken. I mean, we know what that's like right now, to be doing the very best that you can, but things are still going wrong. And so for a season of time, I kept a lot of that to myself. I would talk to my now husband about it a little bit, but I was still hesitant to share the depth of really the agony that I was going through. It was just something that I thought was between me and God, but that I had to bring it to God in sorrow and in almost like, I'm so sorry that I'm having these thoughts. Please forgive me for having these thoughts. Because I didn't know anything about OCD. I didn't really understand the way that the brain can sometimes just throw things at you without your conscious choice. And So I automatically assumed that everything that was coming into my head was because I had done something wrong. So there was a lot of time spent talking to God about needing his forgiveness, asking him to make that right, asking him to help me understand it. It was still very much I think I have to earn something from you, God, versus I can bring this to you and trust that you're going to help me walk through it with wisdom and grace and love, not just, for everybody else around me and not understanding what's going on, but for myself, most of all.
It can be so hard to let go of some of those honestly just wicked thoughts that hold us back and keep us from moving forward and keep us from being honest with God. But once we get honest with God, it's also, we've talked a lot about this today, it can be hard to raise our hands and admit to other people that things aren't going well. I mean, what was it like for you in your story when you finally raised your hand and said, hey, I'm not doing good right now?
Well, there's a couple of things that I can think about. There's a couple of seasons that were really hard for me when I learned that I had OCD and would recognize that, oh, okay, so these thoughts that I'm having are actually obsessions. And those obsessions are centered on things that matter to me most. And at the time, of course, I had made goodness into such an idol. That was one of the things that mattered to me most, was my identity as being a good woman, a good person. So there was a season where I was struggling to be alone. And because I had lost my job, I had graduated with my master's degree, we had bought a house, I was working freelance, and I was at home a lot. It was a new environment, and there was a lot of changes happening. And I started having this intrusive thought, like, what if I suddenly snap and do something terrible that I either can't remember, or worse, if I do it on purpose? So I would avoid being alone. And that's not sustainable behavior. But I would leave the house in the mornings when my husband left for work, and I would come home only when he got home. And finally, I just said, okay, I can't do this. I need some help. And I reached out to my small group, and I told them, I'm having a hard time. And one day I came home from work, and I was sitting in the driveway waiting on my husband to come home because I didn't want to go in. And I looked up and I saw a bouquet of sunflowers on the front porch, which are my favorite. And it was from one of the women in my small group. And then the next day there was another bouquet of flowers, and then another, and then another. And it went on for a whole week. And that was such a really powerful thing for me to see, that I could share and be vulnerable with a group of people who didn't have the mental illness that I did. They weren't struggling in the same way, but that they were willing to sort of bring me in and say, we love you, and we're here for you, and we're in this with you. And we want to give you that tangible reminder that it's okay for you to open up and talk about what's happening.
It's remarkable to think about how our stories connect with other people's stories, and how really other people, God brings them into our lives at times when we need them, like your small group. And I think so much of your story, we can hear the journey. And that's a lot of what we've been talking about today throughout this morning, is that this idea of letting go of perfect, like it's not magic. It's not something that just happens instantaneously. It's really a process. And even coming to grips with the idea that we're not okay, like that alone doesn't make us okay. It's another part of the process. So what has this journey kind of looked like for you? What has this process been like?
I think one of the biggest things that I've had to come to terms with is that there are going to be things in my life that God is going to have to continue to teach me over and over and over. For me, it has been having a mental illness. It's not something that you process through once and then you're done. It's something that you live with. And my healing is not something that has happened all at one time. And I know that God could do that in a second. He's done it before, and he'll do it again. But I have had to go through a lot of different things where God has had to completely transform what it is I thought about him and what it is I thought about myself. And I think about the year after my daughter was born, I struggled again with the same kind of obsession with being alone with her, because your obsessions kind of latch on to what it is that means the most to you. And as a parent, it's my children.
Sure.
So I was scared of being alone with her because I was afraid, what if something happens? What if I do something wrong? And so I would avoid that. Again, not sustainable behavior. And I had to work through that with a counselor. And my husband was a huge support, as well as my small group and my family. We got through it. I learned about the scientific biological perspective of OCD and how the brain works, and that was really helpful. And having that really big faith community around me. And then we decided that we were going to have another child. And at that point, things were great. I had worked through this. And then immediately after my son's birth in May of 2019, on top of having OCD, I sank into a really severe and in some cases, life-threatening postpartum depression. And I was so angry with God about that. I would stand here in this sanctuary and sob because I was so upset. I thought, I have been here before. I thought I was done with this. And here I am again. And not only do I feel like you're making me go through something that I'd already fixed, I'd already gotten right, but you seem like you're completely silent. I thought God was just gone. And that was devastating to me as somebody who'd walked through faith my whole life. One of the verses that I think I might have heard, I don't know, in church or with a friend, but it's when John is giving testimony about Jesus, and he says, for the one whom God sends speaks the word of God, and he gives the Spirit without limit. And that was what I saw happen in my life, was that God was not too big to show up in those small things that were helpful to me, like conversations with my husband, community with my small group, counseling sessions, anxiety medication. All of those things were so helpful for me. And what I've had to learn is that while I haven't experienced the full physical and mental healing that I wanted, what has been healed is the view that I had of God growing up, that he was just waiting on me to mess up. And so that's completely transformed my faith, because I was really good at following the rules and performing my religion, but I didn't know the person of Jesus, and now I do.
I love the way you put it in your book. And I want to read this because it's actually the subtitle of your book, that you're letting go of perfect for the sake of holy, which is so much of what I hear in your story. So what does this idea of holiness mean to you, maybe now versus what it meant before, or just specifically what's it mean now?
I think before it was the perfection part of it. It was the perfection is something that we try to attain. It's what we're running after. It's what we want to get for ourselves. I was trying to earn my goodness. I thought that was my responsibility. And wanting to be good, that's not in and of itself a bad thing.
Sure.
It's a wonderful thing. And it's evidence of being created by someone who was perfect. The issue was that when I made it all about my performance, it kept God at arm's length. And what I had to come to understand was that holiness is something that already belongs to me. And I remember a couple of years ago, Andy was preaching, and he said something that stuck with me. He said, when you become a believer, what's true about Jesus becomes true about you. And in my worst moments, that was something that I was able to cling to was, well, I know who Jesus is. I know Jesus is good because he said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And we have scripture that tells us what Jesus was like. So if what's true about him is true about me, then that means that I'm good too. And I wanted to make that distinction in the book that we already have what it is that we're looking for.
It's such a freeing thought to think about this idea that what is true of the Son, of the creator of the universe, our creator, is true of us. And that I love some of these things you've said, that he's not too big to show up in our small moments, and that if he's good, then we can be good, even when what's on the inside of us is screaming that we're not good or that we don't measure up. It's such an incredible, incredible thought. You've already been so vulnerable with us, but I would be a little remiss not to ask if you would maybe be a little bit more vulnerable with us in a second, and just ask. I want to ask you this question that we've kind of been asking ourselves today. So, in this season, how are you doing? I mean, how are you holding up? We've kind of been wrestling with that question today.
Well, this season has definitely had its challenges, like it has for everybody. I'm still in counseling every week. It's been tough to sort of break up the monotony. I think that's one of the biggest things right now is being at home with your family. It's easy to just get stuck thinking that those day-to-day things that you're doing don't matter. You miss family, you miss friends. I mean, all of those things that we take for granted. And right now, I'm just trying to focus on my book. I lost my job a couple of months ago. It was unexpected. And so that was hard, but it's also given me an opportunity to be more present with my family, to think more about the book release, and also about homeschooling my daughter, which I wasn't able to do last year because I was getting a lot of help. And I'm going to be able to go back to that this year. So it's just taking the good in with the bad, like I think we're all having to do.
Yeah, I love to hear how you're finding joy, even in the midst of probably the hardest season that any of us have ever lived through. Thanks so much for taking time out to sit down with us, talk with us. Thanks for just honestly being real with us. I think it's encouraging. I know it is to me. I'm sure it's encouraging to a lot of people to hear that we don't all have it together, and it's okay to not be perfect, and we don't have to pretend. So I can't wait to see what all happens through this book. Thanks so much for hanging out with us today, Wendi.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. You guys can learn more about Wendi's book, Good Enough, at wendinunnery.com, or you can catch her podcast, So OCD, where she talks about living and learning to thrive with obsessive compulsive disorder. Wendi, thanks again for being here. I'm so grateful for you. I'm so thankful for your willingness to share a little bit about your story.